The sterile hum of a pediatric ward in Gansu province offered no comfort to the frantic parents gathered there in the late summer of 2008. Their infants, some only weeks old, were screaming in agony, their tiny bodies unable to pass urine. Ultrasound screens revealed an impossible horror. Kidney stones, an affliction almost unheard of in babies, were blocking their fragile urinary tracts. These were not isolated anomalies. Across the hospital, and soon across the nation, a terrifying pattern was emerging, one that traced back to the very substance meant to nurture new life. The source of their suffering was a powdery white substance, mixed with warm water and fed in quiet, loving moments. Infant formula, specifically the widely trusted Sanlu Group brand, had become a vessel for poison. This was not a tragic accident of manufacturing, nor a bacterial oversight. It was a calculated, lethal deception executed for profit, a corporate betrayal that weaponized the most fundamental bond of trust between a mother and the nourishment she provides her child. To understand the anatomy of this massive fraud, one must look past the hospital beds and into the sprawling, fiercely competitive dairy industry of early 2000s China. Demand for milk was exploding, far outpacing the capacity of local dairy farmers. To stretch their supply, middlemen operating milk collection stations began diluting raw milk with water. But watered-down milk would fail industry quality checks, which measured protein levels by testing for nitrogen. The fraudsters needed a phantom protein, a chemical mimic that could fool the testing equipment. They found their ghost in melamine. Melamine is an industrial chemical, a compound rich in nitrogen, typically used to manufacture plastics, fertilizers, and flame retardants. When added to diluted milk, it artificially spiked the nitrogen readings, creating the illusion of high-quality, protein-rich dairy. It was cheap, it was undetectable by standard tests, and it was fundamentally indigestible. Inside the delicate kidneys of an infant, melamine binds with cyanuric acid, crystallizing into jagged stones that tear through tissue and shut down renal function. The agonizing cries of the poisoned babies echoed the profound vulnerability of the victims. These parents, many of them rural and working class, had spent a significant portion of their meager incomes on Sanlu formula. Believing the brand's aggressive marketing promises of health and vitality, they had sacrificed to give their children a strong start, only to discover they had been purchasing toxic dust. The realization that their devotion had been manipulated into a mechanism of harm shattered their reality. As pediatric wards overflowed, a localized panic began to quietly morph into an investigative pursuit. Doctors in Gansu were the first to connect the dots, noting that the afflicted infants shared a single dietary link. They sounded the alarm, sending reports up the medical hierarchy. Yet the initial response was not a swift recall or a public warning. Instead, the truth encountered a wall of corporate obfuscation. The Sanlu Group, a titan of the Chinese dairy industry with revenues approaching $1.4 billion and partially owned by the international dairy cooperative Fonterra, had been receiving consumer complaints about discolored urine and sick babies for months. Internal documents would later reveal that executives knew about the melamine contamination long before the public was alerted. But 2008 was a year of immense national pride. The Beijing Olympics were approaching, and the directive from the highest levels of local government was absolute stability. Bad news was to be suppressed. The cover-up was as systemic as the fraud itself. Local officials in Shijiazhuang, the city where Sanlu was headquartered, actively delayed reporting the crisis to the central government. They prioritized economic optics over public health, orchestrating a silent containment strategy while poisoned formula continued to line supermarket shelves. The corporate betrayal had metastasized into a political conspiracy, leaving millions of infants in the crosshairs of a hidden epidemic. The silence could only hold for so long against the weight of a mounting death toll. The turning point arrived not from internal audits, but from the relentless pressure of the international partner, Fonterra, and the courageous persistence of investigative journalists. When the New Zealand government bypassed local authorities and directly alerted Beijing, the dam broke. In September 2008, the Chinese government finally acknowledged the massive fraud, initiating a nationwide recall that laid bare the staggering scale of the disaster. The numbers were apocalyptic. An estimated 300,000 babies had been sickened. More than 50,000 were hospitalized. At least 6 infants were dead. The revelation sent shockwaves through the nation, transforming grocery stores into scenes of weeping, desperate parents demanding answers and refunds. Sanlu was not the only culprit. Subsequent testing revealed that 22 dairy companies, including some of the largest national brands, had melamine-tainted products in their supply chains. The rot was industry-wide. This unmasking forced a brutal societal reckoning with the dark side of rapid economic expansion. How had the pursuit of wealth so thoroughly eroded basic human decency? The middlemen who added the chemical, the executives who hid the data, and the officials who silenced the doctors were not monsters acting in a vacuum. They were participants in a ruthless ecosystem that rewarded cost-cutting and punished transparency, an environment where the abstract concept of a profit margin eclipsed the visceral reality of a dying child. The public demand for retribution was deafening. The Chinese government, facing an unprecedented crisis of legitimacy, responded with a sweeping crackdown. The state orchestrated a highly publicized series of trials, parading executives and milk dealers before the cameras. The chairwoman of the Sanlu Group was sentenced to life in prison. 2 men, a milk powder salesman and a dairy farmer who produced and sold the melamine-laced protein powder, were executed. Yet this swift, severe justice left many families feeling hollow. The executions severed the most visible heads of the Hydra, but they did little to address the deeper systemic failures of regulation that allowed the Hydra to grow. Parents who attempted to organize and demand greater compensation or long-term medical care for their chronically ill children found themselves silenced, harassed, and even imprisoned by the very state that had promised them justice. The pursuit of a true reckoning was deemed a threat to social harmony. For the families of the victims, the aftermath was an enduring, suffocating nightmare. The physical scars borne by the children, many of whom required multiple surgeries and faced a lifetime of renal complications, were a daily reminder of the poison they had ingested. But the psychological injury was equally profound. The parents were haunted by a crushing, misplaced guilt, tormented by the knowledge that their own hands had mixed the tainted bottles. The echoes of that manipulation lingered long after the trials concluded. The Chinese milk scandal fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of consumerism in the nation. Trust, once shattered at such a primal level, could not be legislated back into existence. Domestic infant formula became a symbol of dread. A mass exodus from local brands occurred, triggering a desperate global scramble for foreign milk powder. Chinese parents, driven by a fierce protective instinct, began emptying shelves in Hong Kong, Australia, and Europe. They enlisted friends, relatives, and professional smugglers to ship tins of formula across borders. This frantic gray market was a physical manifestation of a broken social contract. It was a stark declaration that the citizens no longer believed their institutions could protect their most vulnerable. Looking back at the timeline of the deception, the warning signs were glaringly obvious. The sudden, unnatural spikes in milk production yields, the quiet murmurs among farm laborers about the artificial additive, the early, isolated medical reports that were brushed aside as anomalies. The truth was always there, buried under layers of willful ignorance and corporate greed. It required only someone willing to look past the profit margins and see the human cost. The legacy of the Sanlu Group is a permanent stain on the history of global commerce. It stands as a grim case study in the catastrophic consequences of unregulated ambition. When the mechanisms of oversight fail, and when the moral compass of an industry is calibrated solely to financial gain, the resulting collateral damage is measured in human lives. The melamine crisis was not merely a failure of food safety, it was a profound moral collapse. The ripples of this collapse extended far beyond China's borders. The scandal triggered a global crisis of confidence in Chinese manufacturing. Countries around the world banned imports of Chinese dairy products. and international brands scrambled to audit their supply chains, terrified that the toxic chemical had secretly made its way into their own goods. The corporate betrayal had infected the global food network, proving that deception in one corner of the world can poison the entire well. We are left to grapple with the chilling reality of affinity fraud on a mass corporate scale. Affinity fraud typically involves exploiting the trust within a specific, close-knit community, but Sanlu had built its empire on the image of a caring, maternal entity, a brand that understood the hopes and anxieties of new parents across an entire nation. They weaponized this carefully cultivated affinity. They used the language of care to deliver a fatal dose of indifference. It is a stark reminder that the most dangerous betrayals often come wrapped in the guise of protection and nourishment. The pursuit of truth in the wake of such devastation is a bitter, uphill battle. The journalists who exposed the cover-up, the doctors who refused to stay silent, and the parents who fought for their children's lives demonstrated profound courage in the face of immense power. Yet their victories were inherently tragic, arriving only after the damage was irreversible. They unmasked the deception, but they could not turn back the clock. Today, the Chinese milk scandal remains a haunting cautionary tale. It forces us to interrogate the invisible chains of trust that bind us to the corporations that feed us. Every time we open a package, every time we prepare a meal for a child, we are operating on a fundamental assumption of safety. We are trusting that the systems designed to protect us are functioning, that the pursuit of profit has not eclipsed the sanctity of human life. When that assumption is violated, the resulting darkness is absolute, leaving a legacy of shattered faith that takes generations to rebuild.